this is the last session of this absolute marathon that we subjected our dear filmmaker Walter Salles to. And, well, he's a bit of an accomplice to that, because I did submit the entire program to him. He said, okay. I said, are you sure? Yeah, okay. And I did want Central Station to be discussed in this event. And when I mentioned that to him, which film by him we would be choosing, it was almost obvious that we should discuss Central Station. And immediately he said, I would love to discuss this with Geoff Andrew, because he had gone through a wonderful session at the BFI where he thought that the questions were so spot on and inspiring for him. And he so much trusted the sensibility of Geoff Andrew that he suggested him to me. And so I chased Geoff, and obviously he was delighted, even though he had to cancel a concert to come here today. I'm really grateful that you did that. So I owe you something, maybe give you the tickets for another concert later on. So Geoff, as you all will be aware, is today programmer at large for the BFI South Bank, even though you were a permanent programmer there, a chief programmer there before. So he was head of film program for the BFI South Bank. He was also film editor of Time Out magazine when it existed. I used it so much, it breaks my heart that it doesn't work as it used to, for many years, and is a regular contributor to Sight and Sound. He's also a program advisor to the BFI London Film Festival. His numerous books on the cinema, including studies of Nicholas Ray and the American indie filmmakers of the 1980s and 90s, and BFI Classics monographs on Kieslowski's Three Colors trilogy and Kiarostami's 10. He's the editor of Sight and Sound's Auteurs series, anthologies devoted to Jean-Luc Godard and Martin Scorsese. He has contributed to many anthologies and DVD extras, lectured widely on the cinema, and served on film festival juries in Cannes, Venice, Istanbul, Turin, Krakow, Morelia, Sarajevo, and elsewhere. In 2009, the French government made him a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. He writes on film, music, very much indeed, and the other arts at geoffandrew.com. I do recommend this website, which is absolutely fantastic. So without any further ado, I will pass the word to you both, and perhaps Geoff will get started, provoking Walter a little bit on the films, and we're going to have some clips, so give me a sign.
Yeah, of course. Okay, I first met Walter when I interviewed him about Central Station. I gave you the tape of Cairo Station afterwards, and we've kept in touch ever since. But if he said that he was so pleased with my sensitive interviewing technique, I should warn you I've changed. So could you tell us what your favourite colour is? No, really. Anyway, let's start by talking about Central Station, because it was a game changer, I think, for the Brazilian cinema. It certainly brought you to very much international attention, even more than Foreign Land had done, but it also, I think, helped pave the way for other Brazilian filmmakers. It was very much the start of a renaissance for Brazilian cinema. And how did the idea for this film come about in the first place?
Well, before anything else, I'd like to say that how honored and privileged I have to be in conversation with you again. We've done that many times throughout several films, and it's been a renewed joy to discuss films with you on events like this and in life, and also share the admiration that we have for certain filmmakers and so forth. So thank you very much to start with. Central Station was an idea that perhaps the only idea that came to me as an evidence. One day I just woke up with the basic structure of it in my head, and I wrote for that full day, approximately 20 pages, with the structure, the characters, everything else. And if that happened, it was because of, I would say, it was a reflection of what we were going through in the country at that time, and I have then to frame this period in time. Brazil had gone through 24, 25 years of military dictatorship, which then were followed by a completely chaotic government by Fernando Collor. That government was so disastrous that for the first time the country became a country of emigration. 800,000 people, due to the economic chaos, went to exile elsewhere, and therefore after the political exile of the 70s and 80s during the military dictatorship, you had the economic exile of the 90s, which the previous film I had done, which was A Foreign Land, tries to represent. So it's a story of young exiles in Lisbon. And after, I would say, so many dystopian times, I think that there was a sense in Brazil that finally we could try to reinvent a country. You know, after going through so many drawbacks and having the impression that kind of myth of Sisyphus, of always trying to reach a position and then going back, could have reached an end, and therefore the idea of refiguring out what we could be, after everything that had happened, was very much present in the music, in literature, and it was starting to burgeon in cinema. And I think that the story came as a result of that. So Central do Brasil is the station in the heart of Brazil, but it's also the center of the country. And the journey of this young kid looking for the hypothetical father in the interior of the country was, in fact, for me, the search for a possible country called Brazil. And the journey of resensibilization of Dora, the character played by the extraordinary Fernanda Montenegro, was, I think, descriptive of those who had to live a certain kind of life during the military dictatorship, and somehow had to reinvent themselves, or would need to reinvent themselves, and this is what the film, offers her, is that kind of possibility. So it's a film where the journey of the characters somehow blend with the journey that the country was trying to reach.
I mean, like all your films, you take a story of individuals, but it's a story that reflects more widely on the politics and social issues of the country, or indeed the continent, in some cases. It's interesting. I was watching the film again for the first time in some years the other day, and on this beautiful new Blu-ray restoration, and it's at one point you get, just after they've come across the religious festival, and she passes out. We've just seen a picture of the Virgin and Child on the wall, and then she collapses, and we get an inversion of the Pietà, with her being cradled by Josué. And it struck me in a way that the entire film is about inversions. It's an inversion in their relationship. It's an inversion in terms of the power between them. It begins, as somebody earlier on said, it's another story of an elderly woman and a child who she doesn't really want to have to deal with. It's Cassavetes Gloria, which you hadn't seen when you made this. And it's a very different film. But on one level, it's a story of this woman reluctantly looking after Josue, and then he actually looks after her, and she is sort of reborn, really, through rediscovering herself through her feelings for him. Did you think of it in terms of sort of an inversion, because it starts off in the city, it goes right into the inland, it starts off with crowds and close-ups, and gradually you get more long shots and empty spaces?
Well, the idea of inversion, you framed it so well. I think was at the very birth of the film. Actually, this one scene that I would like to start to focusing on that. Then I'm going to go back to the architecture of the film and to talk, about the same subject. But the interesting part of that procession is that it wasn't really in the screenplay to start with, and during the location scout, we started to bump into those processions and those events, and I think that film and screenplays must be essentially porous.
Yeah.
And you have to bring in whatever you encounter, and especially in road movies, even more porous than other films, and therefore that was included in the screenplay. And of course, those religious Romeiros, how do you say that in English?
Pilgrims?
Those pilgrims in the Catholic tradition, they were incorporating exactly what you mentioned at the beginning. So we opted to do the scene with real, with people who would actually be going in that direction. And we had 800 non-actors. Gael Garcia Bernal says that non-actors are non-actors for 10 minutes, then on the second take they become actors. but we had the absolute understanding that we couldn't ask them to do a second take, because this was too important for them. We laid the shots and the traveling shots so that every take would be a one take, mirroring Kieslowski's idea that everything should be a take one. So mostly everything in that scene, in that sequence, is are shots with just one take. And it's the example of a scene where I completely lost control of what was happening. We launched it to the point where they raise, and then from that moment on, the representation of that event became the event itself. Let's say the dramatization of that gained a logic of its own. And for instance, the man who puts the stone on his head, or the woman who starts to actually ask for something, whatever is external to the house of miracles, as we call it in Portuguese, a lot of that came in that moment. So I would say that the religious imprint of the film became much more important due to the fact that we lost control.
But it's crucial in a way, because for one thing, doing it that way increases the sense of authenticity about the film, because you are basically almost shooting documentary. But also it adds to the sort of theme of the film, in the sense of hope and faith, trust, not necessarily in God, but faith
Yes,
that things will
not
happen.
religious,
Yeah.
no, definitely. But also to answer your question about the inversion, the whole film was constructed on the idea that we needed to actually subtract a lot of elements or add a lot of elements that we would later invert in the film. So just one example, as I wanted to underline the loss of identity in the beginning in the station, what you have is are shots with very little depth of focus and layers and layers of sound, creating a certain cacophony.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Godard says that cinema is about subtraction more than anything else, and we subtracted colors. So you only have tones of grays and beiges, marrons,
Beige.
and beige, because such was the life. What you're espousing is Dora's, the Fernando Montenegro character's life, and as the film progresses and that she's obliged to follow the journey of the kid, and she somehow gains a new perception as the kid approaches the hypothetical father, then the depth of focus changes. The lenses stop to be long lenses and we open to 50s and then 35s and then 25s, and colors that we had refused at the beginning of the film start to invade the film. Greens and blues. There's no sky in Rio, if you think of it, and oranges and all of that inversion that you very well spotted on is something that was in the initial architecture of the film, to the point where from the 100 layers of sound of the beginning, at the end you have 2 layers of sound. It's just silence and a dog that barks and wakes up the child, who then realizes that she has gone, and the wind on the back. There's just those 2 layers going on.
I heard some crickets.
And crickets. There you go, 3 layers.
I'm not sure crickets
but the idea,
constitute a layer, but
the idea is that through the image you could now pinpoint everything that is there, and through the sound you could also gain focus, as her life was also gaining the possibility to find a new possibilities and new horizons.
It's so full of different themes. It's about innocence and experience. It's about the power of money and the influence of money and cynicism and optimism and whatever. But without discussing the themes in detail, I did want to ask the scenes of the letter, the people who are reading the letters to her that they want to, speaking the letters to her, were those written, or was that actually sort of done with non-actors that actually,
So 6 or 7 months before doing, starting, or maybe more than that. But anyway, I had done a documentary about
Socorro Nobre.
Yes, called Socorro Nobre, which tells about the exchange of letters between a woman in prison and an old sculptor that had immigrated to Brazil called Franz Grasberg, and she didn't know him, and she read an article which was 1 year old in the prison, in which she was fascinated by the fact that he would go to the Amazon forest, take burned wood and grant it a second life. And then she said, this is what I would like to do with my life. And she wrote to him about that. And I had done a documentary for television about him. And when he showed me the letter, I said, well, maybe we should do a second documentary, which we did in 3 days, and the result is Socorro Nobre. So I had seen what a letter could generate, and that also kind of spanned the starting point of the film, which is what would happen if letters never got to their destiny, if they were interrupted. So this is the basic mechanic that was in my mind before I woke up with the idea. So just to frame it better, so we started to film. That was the first day of shoot, actually, and we got the authorization for Socorro Nobre, who was still in prison, to be and dictate the letter that she would create, and the letter that she decided to do was for the lover that was in prison as well, and that she hadn't seen for long. So the very first person in the film is dictating a letter. I had no idea of what it would be. Then certain scripted letters appear, but then as we were in the middle of the station, this was pre-digital, pre-iPhone era. The film started to be again invaded by people who wanted to dictate letters, and illiteracy was still very much present in Brazil, thus explaining why the figure of the letter writer was an important go-between, and now you can deal with the message on the phone, but at that time you could not. And I had seen letter writers at the central station, and but again it's a blend of scripted and non-scripted. The idea actually of where the people are from is something that popped up as we were shooting, and it's mostly unscripted. It's people that were passing by and that came and say where they come from.
Yeah, people like to be on camera. I think we should actually have the first clip now, if we could, from Foreign Land.
O que é que o senhor deseja?
Preciso de uma informação. O senhor compra instrumentos musicais?
Não, isto aqui assim é só livros de música e partituras. Peço desculpa, mas não temos.
Se foi o senhor que encomendou um violino?
Não, o senhor deve estar enganado. Isto aqui instrumentos não temos, é só livros de música. Peço desculpa.
Miguel, o senhor conhece o Miguel de Moraes?
Miguel de Moraes? Não, assim, de repente, sabes, passa aqui tanta gente, não.
Um rapaz grande, de cabelo comprido.
Pois, não sei, não estou a ver, desculpa.
O senhor tem certeza? Um brasileiro?
Isto é a primeira vez que você vem a Portugal, não é? Posso lhe dizer uma coisa? Isto aqui não é sítio para encontrar ninguém. Isto é uma terra de gente que partiu para o mar. É o lugar ideal para perder alguém ou para se perder de si próprio. Aproveite.
Alô, sou eu do número 4 novamente? Nada. Obrigado. Nada. Que merda. Eu queria falar com você.
Que é você?
Desculpa entrar assim.
Olha, não tem nada a ver com isso, não. Juro, não fiz nada, não tenho nada. Não chega perto de mim.
Calma.
Fica aí, não.
Calma.
Parou.
Calma.
Para.
Não atira.
Fica aí.
Não sou quem você tá pensando, nem sei quem que você é. Que isso, cara?
O que você tá fazendo aqui?
Eu tive entrar, já tinha te visto na livraria hoje.
Cara, você tá me seguindo, cara?
Não tô seguindo ninguém, eu tô procurando o Alex.
O Alex?
O Alex.
O que você quer com ele?
Preciso achar
O que
ele.
você quer com ele?
Você conhece ele?
Responde, porra!
Preciso de ajuda, me deram um serviço com o seno dele.
Quem deu?
Miguel.
Você matou o Miguel, seu filho da
Não
puta!
matei ninguém, cara. Eu cheguei lá e ele tava morto. Eu achei esse papel no meio da escada.
Olha que eu não sei quem é Alex, você vai
te uma
embora
encomenda
agora.
pra entregar
Eu
pra
não
ele.
sei quem é Alex. Vai embora, eu vou atirar, hein?
pode
Vai
me ajudar,
embora, eu
pelo
vou
amor de
atirar. Vai embora. Eu sou a Alex.
Okay, I chose that clip partly because I love foreign land, but also it has Fernanda Torres, who is actually the daughter of Fernanda Montenegro from Central Station. It's also the moment, really, I suppose, where we've had two parallel stories, one starting off in Sao Paulo, and please excuse my Portuguese accent, it's dreadful, and one in Lisbon. Although it's people who feel they don't belong there or they shouldn't be in those cities. And you've had these two parallel stories which come together at this moment in the film when Alex and Paco meet. So it's a film, as you've been discussing, about the relationship between Portugal and Brazil, about colonial legacies, about identity and mistaken identity, as we saw in this, but it's also it's much more generic in some ways than your later films. I mean, you can say the later ones are road movies, but that allows a lot of latitude, and I mean latitude literally. But this does seem to, it's got film noir, it's got suspense, and it's got the passenger to some extent. I mean, how conscious on your part was this, were the echoes of the passenger in this film? Because towards the end it becomes very close to the passenger in many ways.
Well, first we were, emerging from 28 years of silence, if you want to, and especially 3 years where cinema hadn't existed in Brazil. So this film was kind of ignited by a desire not only to tell a story about what was just happening to us, but also as an homage to all kinds of film genres that we loved. So this is why Foreign Land is, on one hand, a thriller. On the other hand, it starts as a drama, and the genres just it's pregnant by so many different genres and so many filmmakers' legacies as well.
Yeah.
I would say that you wrote about Nicholas Ray. Nicholas Ray is also a part of this legacy vendor, certainly. And The Passenger very much so, having been a film that was as influential for me as it was for Daniela Thomas, who co-directed the film with me. I think we were a group of people with the same references, and the same and a group of people who wanted desperately, perhaps to say too many things in the same film.
But that's one of the joys of it, I think. It really does. It's super
its
rich.
imperfections are the result of that utter desire to actually articulate all those thoughts and our, I would say, our admiration for certain forms of cinemas and also for as you said, to frame in a different manner the question of the inversion of the point of view. And in this sense, it does very much the reporter of the passenger in this, in that it proposes a point of view of Portugal seen by by Brazilians, which is the reverse angle of what happened at the beginning, and this is why also it incorporates actors and characters from Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, to have that kind of polyphony of people that were at this reverse angle, that is so present in the passenger.
Yeah. It's but it's still very much a film about the importance and influence of money, which is something that turns up quite often in your films. I think there's it's not that people are greedy, but people need money to exist, and there is a wonderful ending which is deeply ironic. I won't spoil it for if there is anybody here who hasn't seen the film, but it's a very much a even though it's a genre film, it's very much a political film, and that, can you imagine making films that are not political?
Well, coming out of Brazil is kind of difficult. Because the difficulty in Brazil actually is to do fiction, because the reality, it's just I don't know the number of, I can't tell you the number of ideas that are already had developed, and then the reality comes and is so much more violent and so much invasive than what I had tried to represent in a fictional structure. We're constantly seeing that. This is why I think there's such a creative documentary film family in Brazil at this stage. So many different great documentarians, really, and such a difficulty to do fiction beyond the difficulty itself of producing fiction today on an independent standpoint. It's just the capacity to grasp the reality and include it in cinema. So yes and no. I would love to have that option. It's just that it doesn't. It doesn't exist in there. The one thing that we try to do here is also not de-romanticize the idea of exile. Said, in his writings, he says, exile can appear to be appealing on a certain point, but it's not. And I think that the characters in foreign land are imbued by
absolutely.
by
I mean, we
sense.
get so many instances, just petty instances of prejudice.
Yes.
That's why Fernanda's character leaves the restaurant, because of the way she's spoken to her about these Brazilians.
Yes,
And
it's very present. I mean, the manner with which Brazil was seen in a prejudiced manner at that time in Portugal is truly they were cumbersome, and the film represents that. As for the final scene, it's an homage to John Huston in the Sierra Madre.
Of course, yes. I'd never thought of that. We'll move on to other films, but we can't sadly show clips from everything. After Central Station, you made a rather wonderful film for a sort of end of millennium series of films called Midnight, which deals partly with the state of jails in Brazil. And then you made Behind the Sun in 2001, which was taken from an Albanian novel, which is a rather strange thing to do, perhaps. And I know it was your brother who showed you the novel.
Yes.
But what was the real appeal of that story given that you were going to transpose it to Brazil?
Well, you had in Brazil several stories in at that point. I think that I was kind of allowed to look back, having done Foreign Land and Central Station, that had to deal with what was burgeoning in the country at those specific moments. I had kind of the time to choose and to try different ideas, which I did, and I had actually read a few stories about blood feuds in the Northeast that existed between families, and I thought that this could be an interesting starting point for a film that departed from everything that I had done. The Cadaré story is very. It has the clarity of Greek tragedy in many ways, and it has also the sense of destiny, and it's defined by omens and things that hit a chord. When I read the novel and the adaptation, which I did, then Karim Ainuz entered and worked as a co-writer in Behind the Sun. Was the possibility to actually enter new terrain. Truly, I think I continue to be much more interested by what I haven't still investigated or done than by what I've done before.
Yeah.
And in this sense, this film was an attempt to try something historical, which I hadn't done to that point, and at the same time, it was set in a very specific place, which was almost for me like doing theater, and with actors that I loved to work with. It was a very difficult shoot for several reasons, but it's a film that teach me about things that I shouldn't do eventually, and others that I.
Yeah, that's interesting because the film you mentioned, Greek tragedy, and this is a film which does a lot of play with the elements. It's sort of very elemental. It deals with the fire and water and the earth, and the sun and dirt, and it feels very a primal drama in many respects. But then you went and made a film completely different, which was The Motorcycle Diaries. And actually, it would be nice if we could have the next clip, please.
Tú. Ven de arriba, vamos. Van bien, tú. Apúrense, muchachos, apúrense, tú. Apúrense. Arriba el camión. Los demás para la casa, afuera. Apúrate, hombre, apúrate, rapidito, vamos. Ya, arriba. Listo ese camión. Ok. Voy a llevar el otro camión. Sí, vamos. ¿Y ustedes dos? ¿Qué hacen aquí?
Nada, estamos mirando.
¿Mirando qué, weón? Esto no es atracción turística. ¡Fuera!
Oiga, ¿usted no se da cuenta que esta gente tiene sed? ¿Por qué no le da un poco de agua, carajo,
Mi vida, llévate lo mejor, ¿no? Antes que llame seguridad para que te encierren, weón.
¿Por qué?
¿Por qué? Invasión de propiedad privada. Este es territorio de la Anaconda Mining Company. ¡Ya, andando!
¡Hijo de puta!
Al salir de la mina sentimos que la realidad empezaba a cambiar. O éramos nosotros. A medida que nos adentramos en la cordillera, encontramos cada vez más indígenas, que ni siquiera tienen un techo en lo que fueron sus propias tierras. Finalmente entramos en el Perú, gracias a un camionero medio ciego, Félix. Ah, y me olvidaba. Hoy Alberto cumplió los 30, pero no en Venezuela como lo había previsto. Estábamos tan fundidos, vieja, que ni pudimos celebrar.
O sea, es humanamente imposible esto.
Por fin llegamos al corazón de América, como llaman al Cusco. Al entrar a la ciudad, encontramos a don Néstor, un hombre muy sabio, vieja, que terminó siendo nuestro guía oficial.
Oiga, caballero, y yo me pregunto, ¿cuál de estos muros es inca?
Este viene a ser el muro inca y aquello español. Ahora nosotros, a forma de burla, decimos el muro de los incas y el muro de los incapaces, que eran los españoles. En la época inca, el Cusco venía a ser lo que es la capital de los incas, ¿no? Sí. Pero cuando vinieron los españoles, comenzaron a destruir todo, nombraron de capital a Lima.
¿A Lima?
Y
claro.
actualmente Lima es la capital. Es la compañía.
¿Funciona como tal?
Sí. ¿A qué se funciona?
¿Funciona como tal?
A ver, ella dice que nunca ella ha conocido escuela ni colegio porque siempre ha estado al lado de los ganados y por eso no sabe hablar castellano, solamente quechua. Desde que he crecido, a lo menos antes, alcanzaba a mi manera de pensar para todo. Su plata, pero ahora hay creo poca plata y no hay trabajo. Con todo eso creo que está afectando más y más, pero ahora desde chiquitita he trabajado con artesanía y por eso estoy todavía no tan bajo ni tan alto, estoy así en nivel regular.
I mean, I wish we had 2 hours to talk, or more, about your films, but this is a remarkable film because it is a recreation of the journey undertaken by Ernesto Guevara before he became the political revolutionary, and Albert Granado. But it's also a film in which it deals with Latin American or South American identity as seen by Guevara and Granado, but also as seen by you, the filmmakers, and I use that in the plural because a lot of this film was improvised to some extent with Gael and Rodrigo. Was it always your intention to include so much of the sort of documentary about contemporary Latin America?
Well, at first this was the first project that I hadn't truly opted for or created. It was actually the proximity to the Sundance Institute, where Central Station had been in part developed, that actually ignited the invitation by Robert Redford, who had the rights for the Motorcycle Diaries, and who said, "Listen, I fell in love with this journey. Yet I realized that I don't speak Spanish. I've never been to let South America. So maybe I'm not the ideal director to do this." I said, "Well, being Brazilian, I may not be the ideal director either, you know, because not only are we the only, you know, non-Hispanic country in America, in Latin America, but we also we sometimes don't have the sense of pertaining to you know, to that continent, which is something that singers like Caetano Veloso transcend very easily, and now Argentinian films. I would say that this transit is much more present than it was at the beginning. So I was very much in doubt whether I could do the film, and I also immediately, you know, I replied, you know, I don't even know if it can be done, because you would need to. It's complex, and you would need to do it with basically non-actors in Spanish, and to Redford's credit, he didn't blink. He said, "Well, that's the way we're going to do it, or we won't do it." And therefore, he offered an absolute. He was a dream to work with, because it was as if it, you know, we had created the story. He didn't truly interfere. Yet he was a very good observer when, for instance, we reached the first edit and the second edit. So. Basically, what I tried to do in the film was first to do the journey. I did the journey twice before filming it, feeling authorized to film it. You know, the whole journey that was conducted by Alberto Granado and by Ernesto Guevara, and went to Cuba to see if the two families were interested in, you know, in having me directed that film as well. And thanks to the Havana Film Festival, they knew Foreign Land and they knew Central Station. This was what made the film possible. So I felt kind of a permission to enter into this complex territory. It's a film made by accomplices, in the sense that I truly consider Gael and Rodrigo and the whole crew around us to be co-authors of this, because it was truly a collective film in which we tried to reinvent what had happened in the original journey, and this is pretty much a last frontier still, you know. So we had the freedom to incorporate whatever we wanted to incorporate, you know. If it snowed, we incorporate scenes with it. We created scenes, and the ones you picked from Cusco on are purely improvisational scenes.
Yeah.
And those scenes are made possible by the fact that we were following the kind of a principle that Henri Cartier-Bresson stipulated when he did photographs. Whenever he would enter a place that he had never been into, Cartier-Bresson never took his camera with him. You know, he would go to that place and he would meet the people and see if he would be invited to be there, you know. So when we met those people in Cusco, it was a little bit the same. The young kid, in fact, came to us and said, "Do you want me to show the city? I do that, you know, with tourists, but I see that you're a group." We were very few people. We were 10 people, because there were no scripted scenes in Cusco. There's nothing in Cusco. There was a very short scripted scene in Machu Picchu, and yet we have 8 minutes of the film, you know. So the scene with the kid, and especially the scene with in Quechua with the Quechan women, were scenes where we felt invited to come in. And obviously everything is take one in that. In this sense, Foreign Land was very important to reach this kind of spontaneity. the idea that cinema should incorporate whatever accident happens. On the other hand, the fact that I had done a film that was historical in just previously also helped us to understand what we would need to frame or not frame to make it possible.
It is. It's a wonderfully informative film in many ways, both about Guevara and Grenada, but also about contemporary South America. But it's also a very fresh film. I remember when it came out, everybody was just, wow, you can make films like this. And I remember you sending me photos from when you were pushing the motorbikes around in the snow. It obviously felt like a huge adventure, possibly a difficult adventure to make such a film, but it must have been very exciting to make.
Yeah, we never thought we would get to the end, actually. Interestingly, you mentioned the snow. We scheduled things so that we would get to Patagonia at the beginning of summer, and as we landed in Patagonia on that first day of summer, it started to snow, and we realized it was only going to snow for one day, and I asked, who is willing to put together a few scenes in the snow? And 10 hands raised up, and that's the group that ended up doing those scenes that are so important for the film, because they truly reproduce the spirit of the book, in fact. And this is why I say it's a film by co-authors.
It's just as well you didn't have a team that were bothered by the weather, because otherwise they'd have probably said, can we shoot this in a studio or something? Anyway, it's interesting because it is perhaps the ultimate road movie in a way, but then you also went on to make a film of the ultimate road movie novel, which is On the Road. Although I'm passing over Linha de Paz, which was an important film because you worked mainly with non-professionals in that. But On the Road was again a big road movie, but it was in America. Actually, it wasn't just an American movie, but you were shooting in the States. Did that make it difficult in any ways? Because the whole system there is so different.
Just a little while ago, I said that I was always interested, but by what I haven't investigated yet. And in many ways, perhaps I was entering for the first time a terrain where I had already been into too many times, which was the road movie, and I tried, to see if I could make justice to that kind of free-flowing counterculture movement that was so important for my generation. That was so informative of the way we looked at the world. And I said, well, would it be interesting to blend this experience of inventing a film every single day with those elements. What I found out is that it's practically impossible to do it, at least as we tried to do, in the sense that there was not even a hint of that freedom that we had in the Motorcycle Diaries, and that was reached in the Motorcycle Diaries almost miraculously, because we were from so many different countries. There were Mexicans, Peruvians, Chileans, Brazilians, Argentinians. There we were with that common goal that became clearer and clearer.
Real diversity, but with unity.
Well, and we're talking about diversity, and the group itself the family was diverse, Yeah. And the spirit of independent filmmaking was very much present, and in this whole group of scenes that you have there, the actors had their own, their clothes. There were no art directors on the set. We were very few people. I was doing one of the two cameras in this scene. Eric Gauthier, the DP, is doing the second one. So we were all kind of in the set of on the road that could not, for instance, frame. You're not allowed to move a chair. It's everything is very much, I would say, structured in a way to serve that kind of economy of cinema. It's for the first time that I had the impression that such thing as an industry exists. Jack Lang says that cinema, you can't talk about industry, but because they are only prototypes. Every film is a prototype, and it's true that in the American system, you're not talking about that anymore. No. And in this sense, I think it was a very difficult film to make. But I don't think that I also actually managed to find with clarity the way to break that. Because of course I had accepted to submit to that system. So I had to have a strategy to somehow deconstruct it, and it wasn't solid enough.
But I did watch the film again a couple of days ago. It's the first time since I saw it in Cannes, and I must say it stands up very well, and possibly is better than it was given credit for. It's got an amazing cast, and it has a feel of freedom. It's not like this sort of freedom, but it's got a nice disregard for the 3-act narrative and all that stuff, which Hollywood believes so ridiculously in. This is, in a way, you're going back to what the Lumieres did, and Hollywood has nothing to do with what the Lumieres did at all. But anyway, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I do want to talk about the Zhejiang Ke documentary, partly because why you wanted to, how that came about, but also one thing I've tried to sort of illustrate a little bit through these clips is the presence of documentary in nearly all your work. And I mean, do you even make a real distinction between fiction and documentary? Because even with documentaries, you're making choices all the time.
Jean-Luc Godard, who has a good sentence about everything, as you all know, says that a great fiction film drifts towards documentary, and a great documentary drifts toward fiction films. I'm not sure about the second part of the sentence. Zhejiang Ke, on the other hand, he has a sentence about this exact confluence, saying that whatever he's doing a fiction film, he tries to betray fiction by bringing in the documentary. And whenever he's doing a documentary, like in 24 City, he brings in the fiction to destabilize it. And I was always tempted to find, the possible merging points of those two narrative forms, but almost more intuitively than on a purely concretely a starting point. The desire to do the Zhejiang Ke film drifted from an invitation. There's a series in France, actually created by one of the how do you say, idealizers of the Cahiers du Cinéma, which focuses on a filmmaker, and I was invited to do one of those films that should have 52 minutes, and they asked whom I would like, to focus on. I said Zhejiang Ke, who is way younger than I am. Said, no, it should be, I don't know, I'd like to do this about Jean-Jacques. And I think that this decision dressed from the fact that very few directors offer a reflection of what truly happened with globalism and with this transition that happened in the world, but in China even in particular, from one kind of orthodoxy to another kind of orthodoxy, which is the market economy.
Yeah.
And the way into that is always through the stories that affected me so much in an existential standpoint, you know, from pickpocket to the world, to every single film touched me so deeply. It was they somehow, Jean-Jacques brought back the sense of enamorment and enchantment and almost astonishment that I had with The Passenger. It's that kind of relationship, really, and this is what fostered the desire of this documentary. The proposition was made 2 years before we shot, and then one day he offered to he said, okay, well, let's do it. And in fact, I have to say that he was so generous that Jean-Jacques is really a co-author in that, in the sense that he brought us not only to the scenes of the films that he had made, but he also invited us into his circle of friends and families who are incredibly structural to the films that he made, and very strong influences. So it was one of the most the fondest memories that I have of shooting a documentary are certainly this one with Jean-Jacques at the end of the world for me, and yet it felt like I was very, very near something that I knew.
Yeah.
You know?
So for once, even though you were in China, you didn't feel like an outsider. Anyway, I'm afraid we have run out of time. We could have gone on for hours, and you might have even stayed. But I'm sorry we couldn't cover more things. But please do thank Walter Salles.